This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with Step 3, Construct the Alternatives, some additional points. We'll work through two topics. First, the things governments do, a resource list that Bardak provides in Appendix B of his book. This is a great resource list for purposes of brainstorming on kinds of intervention in the public interest based upon observation and practice. It's a great starting point for coming up with your own wonderful ideas that you will list at this stage of the Eightfold Path. Also, let's strike a cautionary note about the oft-mentioned concept of best practices. Bardak cautions that we should better think of these as smart practices, and he has some observations which we'll echo on what it really means to think about listing as alternatives policy ideas that are arising at different times and in different places. Let's go over the categories that Bardak provides us in Appendix B, things governments do, and let's give some brief examples of each category. We invite you to read through these categories very carefully and to refer to this list whenever you find yourself at the Construct the Alternatives step of the Eightfold Path. First, government imposes taxes on such things as sales, income, and property. These taxes change private economic incentives for both consumers and producers, and they generate needed revenue for government. Government engages in broad schemes of regulation, which include such things as the Securities Exchange Commission and its programs protecting the purchasers of stocks and equities against fraud. Governments engage in subsidies and grants programs, such as the provision of housing vouchers to renters, food stamps to families who are purchasing food for themselves and for their families, and lastly, research grants to spur research activity and knowledge production. And such activity is familiar in places like the National Institutes on Health. We observe governments engaging in direct service provisions, such as the conduct of fire and police departments, disaster preparedness and 911 departments, streets and highways maintenance and repair, and the like. Information is a separate category that Bardak provides us regarding things governments do. And a good example to bear this one in mind is to think about the ways in which food is labeled, the minimum requirements for food labeling, and the requirement that food labels be uniform. The structure of private rights is a very broad category that Bardak lists. Some examples would be collective bargaining rights in labor law, the rights of families to adopt children in family law, and the ways in which we would review and perhaps revise those regulatory regimes in the structure of private rights as we face the need to develop alternatives for our policy problem that we're analyzing. A separate category of things governments do involves the framework of economic activity itself, such as the antitrust regulation of monopolies generally, and more specifically, the regulation of utilities by such things as public utility commissions at the state level. Government often engages in education and consultation programs, such as warning labels that the Surgeon General might place on things like cigarettes, or when the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, provides health advisories or warns against coming epidemics. The next to last category Bardak lists here is financing and contracting, and a familiar way of remembering this category is the vast and complex world of the military procurement of equipment for our armed services. Lastly, Bardak reminds us that sometimes public policy will look at the creation or the adjustment or even the elimination of agencies, or the change of voting rights, or the ways in which legislatures and executive branch agencies conduct themselves politically. The creation of a new bureau or commission is a familiar form of activity in this category. One way to kind of start to figure out what this resource list provides us in practice is to think of an example problem. We have one here for you. Too many children suffer from obesity. And if we bear that well-defined problem in mind, What we will do is to look through this things governments do list as a starting point for constructing the alternatives, to imagine the kinds of government's intervention that might help us to alleviate this problem. If we concentrate on the lack of healthy exercise among children who suffer from high rates of obesity, we might imagine creating subsidies and grants that spur that kind of activity in schools or in nonprofit organizations. Under service provision, we can imagine circumstances where the government provides parks and recreation programs and could add to those departments the prompting of information, education, and exercise that may help to address obesity. And recently we've seen debates over potentially taxing foods and beverages that are thought to be particularly worrisome when it comes to producing levels of obesity in children. And a familiar example is the fight that's being undertaken in various jurisdictions over taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. Moving on, let us have some brief remarks on this concept of best practices. Everyone who spends time in policy discussions will hear this reference to best practices as something that will be useful to compile. And what Bardak warns us of in part 3 of his text that we've read for this unit is that we should be better thinking about these concepts as smart practices. This is a set of warnings about actually how hard it is to confirm that practices are indeed best, and secondly, if we're convinced that they're good ideas, to recognize that it might not be easy to import them to the environments in which we work. These practices that we observe at other places and times, they may be called best, but they're rarely proven to be through careful and systematic evaluation. And even if they are demonstrated to be sound, these ideas are rarely retested against the change in the environments in which they operate, or the political winds shifting, or the like. These dynamics of policy environments vary. We will be working in various places, various government entities, nonprofit entities, even private sector companies, and we will become very sensitive as policy analysts to what these environments provide, and we will recognize that where we work may be quite unique. If we're going to try to import an idea from some other place, enacted at some other time, we have to be very sensitive to the environments in which these ideas arose. We may be better off thinking about these ideas not as best for all purposes, but simply as smart ideas that we observe. And when we think about transferring them from one setting to another, we have to acknowledge that that process may be more complicated than this notion of best practices seems to assume. Instead, our goal should be, and this is very pertinent for our Construct the Alternatives phase of our Eightfold Path process, that we learn from other places, that we learn from these ideas that seem smart, but that we never assume that smart ideas automatically work everywhere. Overall, when it comes to best practices, or Bardak's revised nomenclature, smart practices, the general tone is to proceed with caution. Reviewing what we've done in this mini lecture, we've looked at Step 3, Construct the Alternatives, some additional points. We've carefully reviewed the categories under the Things Governments Do resource list and seen how this resource is a great place to start when we're brainstorming on kinds of intervention in the public interest. And secondly, we briefly thought through this concept of best practices, and we encourage you to better think of these as smart practices, recognizing that ideas arise in specific places at specific times, and we have to be mindful about how complicated it might be to transfer ideas from one place to another. Thank you for your attention, and we'll now move on to the next unit.